As many of you know by now, a few weeks ago, Obsidian's Avowed launched a pretty mediocre reception. In a year filled to the brim with star-studded releases, Avowed was never going to be a Game of the Year contender, but I'm not quite sure it was ever aiming to be. Many, including myself, were incredibly intrigued by the game's original reveal trailer that had this dark, gritty tone to it, yet I think a lot of people wrote the game off after its gameplay reveal a couple years later showed a massive shift to a more lighthearted fantasy art direction and atmosphere. Since then, it feels like Xbox has massively undermarketed this game, and while I at least still wanted to give the game a chance due to the storied history of Obsidian, I was quite unsure of what it actually was. Upon release, Avowed received a Metacritic score of 80, which is by no means bad, but definitely not amazing. When I read reviews of the game and heard it was solid, but with some noticeable performance issues, I decided this would be probably a wait until I was free type of deal, especially with the game being sandwiched between the two juggernaut releases of Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 and Monster Hunter Wilds that I have yet to touch. However, in the days following release, a massive internet rhetoric started to form around Avowed, one that I have only seen surface with a few titles such as Dragon Age: The Veilguard or Suicide Squad: Kill the Justice League. Many prominent gaming YouTubers said that Obsidian had lost its touch, and others said the game was derivative, boring, and uninspired. There is also a huge online majority that has obliterated the game for its poor writing quality and deemed it nothing more than woke garbage. After seeing all this discourse, I decided I was probably not going to play Avowed as I have too many games to cover in too little time. Nevertheless, a few days later, I sat down in front of my Xbox on a Saturday night and had a change of heart. I don't know if it was the divisive nature of the game that intrigued me, or maybe I was just incredibly bored, but I decided, you know what, why not give the game a shot for a few hours? At the very least, it will make an interesting video for my new channel. Well, a few hours turned into over 20, and at this point I have to say, I don't get it. I really like Avowed, and while it's by no means a masterpiece or some genre-defining title, it is a damn fun game with very few glaring faults. But I never would have guessed any of that from listening to all the petulant rhetoric that keyboard warriors online have crafted around the game. Avowed for me is a primary example of why you shouldn't let reviewers or petty internet fanboys decide what you play, but you should instead make the final verdict yourself. I want to re-emphasize the fact that I'm not trying to act like Avowed is some amazing 10 out of 10 game, because it has some faults that I will get into later, but it does a lot of things surprisingly well, and that's what I want to start with. I think the first thing that really struck me upon booting up Avowed is just how good the game actually looks. When I saw pre-release footage, I was under the impression that the game looked very last gen and lacked impressive visuals. Thankfully, that is not the case at all. Environmental textures in particular here are really crisp and honestly just beautiful to look at. I feel like character details as well honestly aren't bad, especially when considering the art style that Obsidian was aiming for. Speaking of the art style, I think it's also important to address the clear shift from the original reveal. Many critics argue that Obsidian baited everyone by changing the style that was initially teased, and while I for one was also intrigued by the more dark fantasy, gritty atmosphere of that reveal, I think the art style they settled on in the final game is actually pretty good. It takes a more magical, lighter fantasy tone, which I think works really well and distinguishes Avowed from a lot of other games in the genre. This tone is carried over throughout the world of the Living Lands, which is quite unlike any other setting I've seen in a video game. I was never familiar with Pillars of Eternity, so this universe and the lore within it was completely foreign to me. I feel like this can lead to unfamiliar players feeling in over their heads when it comes to the many different gods, races, and geography that the game throws at you, but thankfully, Obsidian provides many sources of exposition, whether it's in the helpful chat feature that explains relevant lore within conversations, or the many documents that can be found throughout the Living Lands. Everything here is pretty interesting, and it makes it feel like you truly are in a small part of what is an otherwise massive fleshed out world, similar to something like Tamriel from the Elder Scrolls or the Continent from The Witcher. I also really enjoy the rich atmosphere of the living lands themselves. It holds that fantastical, magical tone throughout every corner with a mix of both beauty and strangeness. I've only made it to the third region so far, but to this point, they all feel incredibly distinct and diverse. It's not just your typical medieval fantasy world. There's almost a hint of Mediterranean in here, which is awesome as someone who really loved the atmosphere of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. The towns in particular have been pretty solid thus far and feel distinct and memorable from a vibe standpoint. There's only a few of them, but it feels more like a quality over quantity situation, which I am a fan of as each is fleshed out with its own unique character. As a whole, being in the world of Avowed is just very enjoyable due to the magical and wacky feel that makes the living lands feel distinct from a lot of other open world medieval RPGs. There are some issues from an immersion standpoint which I'm going to get into, but just based on the environment alone, the world of Avowed is enjoyable to explore. Thankfully, I would say the actual mechanics of exploration and world design at play here are as good as the atmosphere of the living lands. I think Avowed shines best when you're just out in the world, running around, getting into little skirmishes, finding valuable loot caches, and completing side objectives. Nothing here is revolutionary by any means, but I've seen more derivative open worlds get less hate than Avowed, which really confuses me. It's not the type of game where you just have a huge empty area with a bunch of map markers, go here, do objective until you complete everything, which is what I was initially afraid of. Instead, Obsidian has decided to split the living lands into a few smaller sized zones that all feel very compact with content. There's no empty, meaningless space here. All of it is used pretty well. There's also no map markers or question marks. Instead, the game follows in the philosophy of you see something interesting, go over to it. If there's a house up there on the hill, or a cave, or a lighthouse, go see what's up and you will definitely be rewarded. And rewarded you will be. I mean, there is so much damn loot in this game. I'm usually the guy who looks in every nook and cranny for any possible item to collect, but usually there's nothing to find for it. Instead, here it's like every corner or rooftop you look, it's more likely than not that there will be a chest with some crafting materials or gear, and it helps even more that a sound cue will play anytime you're close to any loot of note. All of this is genuinely solid world design and makes exploring the best part of Avowed by far. Again, nothing revolutionary, but I don't really see any glaring issues here. Avowed also offers some optional quests out in the world. Some of these just involve completing small bounties or treasure hunts in the different areas, while others typically follow your open world RPG type of quest where an NPC has a problem that you have to deal with. I would say the side quests here are better than most and usually aren't just blatant fetch quests, although they definitely aren't overly interesting. I do like that there are some difficult decisions that the game requires you to make to resolve most of these missions, as some of them actually require some consideration and thought. However, I have really yet to see the impact of some of these choices, which is pretty disappointing. There is the occasional quest here and there that rises above the rest, and feels like some really lengthy quality content, so I was happy to come across some of those. However, I do want to say that I don't think any of the open world content would work nearly as well if the gameplay for Avowed wasn't so surprisingly good. Before launch, I was worried that the game's combat looked clunky and would fall into similar pitfalls that a game like Skyrim's combat fell into. Thankfully, that is nowhere near the case. The combat here is very well done. There's a ton of weapon variety that the game gives you to choose from, and each one feels unique and satisfying to wield. Additionally, you can dual-wield one-handed weapons and can have up to 2 different loadouts equipped at once, leaving a ton of options for tackling each encounter. I usually would rock a one-handed sword in one hand with either a gun or wand in the other, allowing a mix of close quarters and ranged combat. Melee combat feels really good, but I'm not as big of a fan of the guns, which I thought were a really cool twist at first, but turned out to be pretty annoying to use due to the nature of reloading. Wands, on the other hand, are kick-ass and feel really good to use, sort of akin to what's found in Hogwarts Legacy. You also have special abilities that can be activated and can be mixed and matched to further customize your character. These feel pretty useful but don't seem overly consequential. Additionally, you have companions that follow you around and will join you in combat. You can issue different commands to each of them and will have to revive them when they are downed. It should be noted that Avowed was actually initially intended to be a multiplayer game, but was revamped to be solely single player, and it definitely shows throughout this system. I overall really enjoyed all the elements to combat and feel like it's very satisfying and polished. However, I do have two main gripes with it. First, the dodge mechanic is very wonky and doesn't really work all that well, as you can only dodge side to side, but can't avoid hits directly behind you. Also, since the game is a mix of first-person melee and ranged combat, enemies that normally just fight melee have the ability to jump across massive distances to hit you, so that you can't just overpower them with ranged weapons. This adds a bit of jank that I think is sort of unavoidable with this mesh of first-person combat. My other issue is with the stamina system. I started the game wearing heavy armor, and it feels like you can barely get a few hits in on enemies without your stamina having to recharge and you being left vulnerable to enemy blows. This does get better if you either upgrade your stamina or switch to lighter armor, but it's still annoying nonetheless. Also, I'm confused why guns and wands require so much stamina, as that is counterintuitive to their entire purpose, but I mean, hey, what do I know? I also want to quickly touch on the enemy and boss design in Avowed. I feel like the game does lack a good bit of variety in this department, and I haven't fought a boss yet that hasn't seemed like a buffed version of an otherwise normal enemy. It's definitely not great, but it's not unbearable. Get it? Right? Because, like, there's a lot of bears in the game to fight. Okay, I'm gonna stop. Okay, so we also have to talk about the actual gear and progression systems of Avowed. I feel like once again, nothing here is revolutionary. You should see a theme, but it all works. You have your different weapon choices that I mentioned earlier, all of which can be upgraded with materials you find out in the world. There's also a few unique weapons that you can find through quests or hidden in random spots that usually have some special status effect or buff. Additionally, you have your primary armor that can be classified in the light, medium, or heavy category, each of which has an inverse relationship between defense and stamina. Aside from these, there are other armor pieces such as bracers and boots that only differ in the unique effects they provide to the player and cannot be upgraded. Avowed also provides its own take on the charm system from games like Souls games, and these can be mixed and matched to once again give you unique stats. All of the gear systems work really well because the game doesn't go out of its way to bombard you with gear pieces, so when you do acquire something new, it feels more meaningful than in other open world RPGs, a la Assassin's Creed Odyssey or Hogwarts Legacy. My only issue with gear in this game is that if your equipment isn't at a certain threshold, you'll experience a certain degree of level gating by being completely overpowered by enemies out in the world. I always hate stuff like this because it's like you can be fighting a bandit just fine, and then 50 feet away you go to another bandit and they absolutely obliterate you. It's a really stupid system that breaks immersion in my opinion. Gear isn't the only way to progress though. You can also level up your character by experience points. Each time you level up, you can put 1 point into a certain stat category that will level different attributes such as stamina, health, damage, magic, etc. It's all pretty generic stuff. You can also put a point into the unique abilities I mentioned above, although it feels like there is a ton to choose from here and I'm still pretty overwhelmed by it. I think with all of these gameplay systems, the theme here is clear. Nothing is revolutionary with Avowed, but its systems are polished and fun enough that the game feels really good to play. There are some issues with the gameplay, don't get me wrong, but they don't do enough to really detract from the overall experience. I do think there are some more glaring issues with Avowed that show up when you examine its story and writing. Avowed is centered around you, a player-created envoy of the Emperor who comes to the Living Lands to investigate the source of a mysterious blight called the Dream Scourge. You experience strange visions and communicate with some unknown being presumed to have given you your godlike powers. It's a pretty generic setup, and the main plot points just sadly aren't that interesting. The characters you interact with along your journey also leave a lot to be desired. Many of them feel forgettable and seem to follow a lot of the predictable tropes seen in other games. The companions in particular were also pretty disappointing. I sort of liked the first companion, Kai, and found him charismatic enough, but the others so far have been incredibly dry and uninteresting. I think a lot of this is because the dialogue feels pretty sloppy and all over the place. People have complained about some of the quality of the dialogue online, and it's kinda hard to disagree. Some of the conversations here are fine, but others are hard to listen to and don't feel believable in the slightest. It's definitely got a little of that millennial cringe seen in games like Dragon Age the Veilguard. I am also not a fan of decisions within dialogue. I'm not quite sure how to explain it beyond saying it's so weirdly executed. I'm going to try to give examples, but usually an NPC will just tell you something and then you can just ask them a question exactly about what they just told you as if you just forgot. Or other times it's unclear whether a dialogue choice is to ask for more exposition or to advance the conversation further. The game will also give you unique dialogue options based on your selected background or specific statistics that you've chosen, but these usually feel so weird and awkward and just out of place. I usually just found myself skipping through a lot of the dialogue as much of it feels redundant and not well executed. Another one of my main issues is just how dead towns and NPCs can feel at times. There was a video that has since gone viral comparing Avowed to Skyrim, and I mean it definitely highlights some issues with the game's immersion. Many of its NPCs wander lifelessly around settlements without any unique behavior or dialogue, leaving streets or even supposedly bustling inns feeling lifeless. This definitely keeps Avowed from reaching the immersion of games such as Red Dead, The Witcher 3, or Skyrim. There are some unique encounters here and there which I was a fan of, but none organic or consistent enough on the level of some of those other games that I just mentioned. Additionally, I think the most egregious example of some of these issues can be seen in the fact that you can literally steal anything in Avowed without consequence. 4 gallons of ale behind an innkeeper? No problem. Take it, it's yours. How about a pile of coin in someone's bedroom? Sharing is caring. You also cannot harm NPCs or kill anyone, which is pretty much a staple of open world RPGs at this point. All this just leads to Avowed lacking a lot of immersion when it comes to some of these systems, and it's a shame that games over a decade old have managed to do better. Okay, so with all this in mind, I can see some of the criticisms of Avowed. It lacks the detail and immersive depth found in far older open world RPGs. Additionally, the story and writing is not memorable by any stretch of the imagination, and I can see some of that cringe factor that people have been complaining about. But I don't think any of this is worthy of the sheer amount of slander that the game has received online. A lot of people act like this is a joke of a video game and not one worth your time, and while I don't think it's even close to perfect, I've seen games like Hogwarts Legacy be artificially propped up even though they are objectively worse games than Avowed. I can't stress it enough, nothing here is revolutionary, but Avowed still manages to be a pretty damn fun video game and has a lot of polished gameplay and exploration systems that make it satisfying to play through. Its unique atmosphere and great visuals also help set it apart from other games in the genre. In the end, I can't help but feel like this is one of those cases where bitter people just like to hate for the sake of it, and were set off since the game decided to include a pronoun option that are never used again, by the way, in its character creator screen. I'm not sitting here to have a political argument over a video game. I, for one, think for the most part, I can do without any of it, as it doesn't add to my experience. But also, if the devs feel so inclined to spread whatever messages they care about, then that's fine too, as long as their game is still enjoyable. I literally couldn't care less one way or another. That's not why I play games. I think it's a damn shame that people have now created a narrative surrounding Avowed that is going to prevent people from giving it a try just because of this rhetoric. I, for one, would handedly recommend this game if you want to just play through a solid open world fantasy RPG with some cool combat. Nothing more, nothing less. If you're hoping for the deepest, most complex AAA RPG known to man, then yeah, you're going to be disappointed. I think it's just one of those cases that has taught me not to believe all the discourse online, but instead that the final verdict should be made by the player themselves.